el enorme interés y potencial de las iniciativas participativas y los prometedores resultados de su uso contrastan completamente con la poca capacidad de los estados de responder en forma innovativa. Mis conclusiones. Las recomendaciones de UNESCO son un buen paso para crear capacidad institucional y facilitar que los países tengan al menos unos mínimos de apertura. Dan tranquilidad sobre mitos. Creo que particularmente el tema de propiedad intelectual es lograr darle tranquilidad a la gente de que se está en un marco legal. Pero no es una guía contextual a necesidades locales. Eso hay que seguirlo explorando y era algo, por ejemplo, que sí tenía muy clara la Declaración de Panamá y quizá tiene sentido, esto pues es algo global. Y no logra recoger que hay muchas prácticas que ya existen en la región y que no están logrando penetrar las políticas. Finalmente, solo quiero mencionar para cerrar como esa experiencia y la conexión con Colombia, en 2022 Colombia lanzó su política de ciencia abierta y de nuevo no es muy diferente a lo que logra hacer UNESCO. Está concentrada en acceso abierto, en datos abiertos, concilió ya esa distancia con entre lo abierto y lo cerrado, la discusión de propiedad aparece intelectual, pero parece que logramos moverla de ahí, y a pesar de su centralidad existen ventanitas, como en las recomendaciones de UNESCO, en donde podríamos ya empezar a localizar y hablar de otros temas. Es decir, el desafío continúa y hay que reconocer que los procesos de cambio pues son lentos. Yo cierro invitando a la iniciativa con la que arrancábamos, y es Hablemos de Otra Ciencia, porque ya en América Latina esto existe, y por favor visiten la página web. Mil gracias. ¡Wow!
Muy bien, gracias, Caro, por introducir un poco también, continuar esta introducción del tema y lanzarnos. También por hacer tus propias traducciones hasta que ya estamos. Entonces, I'm just going to say one thing in English for those that are still listening, that there is now simultaneous translation from Spanish to English and from English to Spanish. Ahora el próximo hablante va a ser Leslie, y a los que él va a estar hablando en inglés, pero es para los que necesitan traducción o interpretación, ya pueden ver el icono del globito en su Zoom y pueden pasarlo y va a haber traducción simultánea de lo que está hablando él, del inglés al español. Leslie, creo que está escuchando en el canal de inglés, entonces sigo en español, pero decir, Leslie, te doy la palabra. Te damos a ti tus 20 minutos para continuar. Y Caro, te cuento que hay una pregunta ya en las preguntas y respuestas. También invito a todos a hacer preguntas durante la presentación y vamos a ir contestándolas, creo que ahí en el texto mismo, y si podemos también robarnos unos minutos al final para continuar. Pero Leslie, bienvenido, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. Te cedo la palabra.
Thank you, Juan Pablo, and thank you, Carolina, for including me in this conversation and in this conference series. I think it's a very timely and important series of conversations that you're hosting. And I particularly like the title of this series, that open science already exists in Latin America. And so I would like to build on this theme, drawing on some of my personal experiences working on various research collaboration and research projects, and some of the practical experience trying to understand how to provide for infrastructures for scholarly communication that are open and equitable. And I will share some of these experiences, some lesson learned, of course, many mistakes that we have made along the way, and hopefully I can provoke some interesting reactions and some questions from you. So I will start sharing my slides, and Juan, if you don't mind, sending me a 3 minutes warning on the chat so that I don't indulge with my time, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Will do.
So let me start my presentation. You are seeing my slide now?
Yes, we see them clearly, Leslie. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I have chosen the title of my talk, calling it Opening Science from Below. And so let me explain to you the origin of this title, which I drew from a very well-known authors, feminist philosopher of science, Sandra Harding. She wrote a book in 2008 called Sciences from Below, in which she really challenges the reader to question the long patriarchal hierarchy of Western science and the kind of hegemonic view about the world through that particular set of epistemological lenses, creating from the so-called modern period a set of universal science that are supposed to be objective and apply everywhere. And her book really took into question a lot of these entrenched notions of universality of science. And she asked us to think about how these constructed narrative favor particular narratives of modernity, about progress, about development, that then created a world of binary world of those who are in charge of science and technology are able to progress, and those countries or regions that have fallen behind because they have lacked the mastery of science and technology. So this, and then the so-called traditional society with traditional knowledge that doesn't somehow advance the society into the modern world. So this kind of dichotomy, this kind of binary, have structures the way we think about development for a long time. And as a student of development, I was raised in that tradition of thinking about the so-called developing world and the developed world, these kind of binaries, one was advanced science, one with traditional knowledge. But of course, she reminds us these binaries, of course, are very much constructed socially by those who are in power and who have the resources to enact and entrench that particular view of the world. But of course, when we study the world, histories and knowledge, we know that there are many, many rich cultural, historical, and scientific traditions around the world, most of which have been largely ignored by mainstream discourse of Western science. And so part of her books was to bring to light the rich and diverse empirical knowledge and epistemological traditions of communities from the global South and from Latin America in particular. Now, that might not seem too radical to think about knowledge in these more inclusive terms, but again, even 20 years ago, the discourse is very much about how to, again, universalize science and its practices. And unfortunately, a lot of current discourse about open science is very much based on that particular modes of narrative that is still favoring a particular view of science in the center, and then adding openness on top of it. So it is a lot about, as Juan alluded to it, about subscribing to certain standards, using certain protocols, and making data open and transparent, and sharing publications as soon as possible, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of sort of technical calling for open science. So so we need to think about many dimensions of open science, and I want to then make these claims that the current open discourse about science and open access really tend to replicate the existing power structures. Those who are in power already, who have a great deal of resources and who are the centers of knowledge production, continue to benefit from this so-called open discourse, whereas those who have been marginalized are being further marginalized by this particular discourse. And so we really need to rethink how to pluralize this particular moment in time to think about a proto-versal framework of openness that centers social justice, and particularly self-determination and autonomy and sovereignty as the design principle for thinking about science and scholarly communication. These are issues that are not given sufficient attention. in my view. And again, there are many Latin American scholars who have been telling us that there are many worlds that are possible in our current world, and by the same token, there are many open sciences that are possible and already exist in Latin America, as this series will illustrate. So we need to learn from the diverse communities, particularly those resides outside of academia. My colleague Bud Hall and Rajesh Tandon, who are UNESCO chairs in Community University Partnership, have always reminded me that 90% of the so-called knowledge that we depend on to live on day by day resides outside of the academia. They're not the kind of formalized knowledge that you see in books and journals, but these are knowledge that exists in the communities, that are enacted in the community, that are passed on from communities from generation to generations. And these are the kind of knowledge that communities need for survival, for well-being, and for interdependencies. But we have a tendency to forget this 90% of knowledge and focus on the very narrow range of so-called academic knowledge that is only beneficial to a small percentage of the population. So we need to look to indigenous communities, Afro-descendants in Latin American communities, many grassroots organizations, the food movement, for example, the climate movement, many peasant communities that call for food sovereignties, and many social movements from across Latin America for land rights, for property rights, for different rights to research, and for coalitions and so forth. So there are lots of lessons to be learned from these different diverse social movements. And again, we have tend not to be paying enough attention to these important movement that we can learn from. Particularly, I want to suggest that we need to look for design principles, design for social justice and for autonomy. And again, to begin to think more about how to integrate these design principles when we design infrastructures for research and for scholarly communication. We need to also, while designing this principle, rethink really the ultimate goal of these systems, what it is that we want to achieve with research, and particularly with openness. What are the end goals? If it's for social benefits, for public well-being, and for collective well-being, then we have to rethink how we sustain these kind of infrastructures. And we have to move away from what we would call the extractive kind of economic frameworks, that is using knowledge as basically resource to be extracted, to be turned into commodities, and then to be sold as different products, and then analytics, kind of extractive cycles that kind of put people out of commission, that use science, data, and everything else as the center, and the people themselves who do the research or whose knowledge are being extracted are actually forgotten in this system. So we need to move away from this extractive system that is really predominant and really pervasive in all our economic transactions, and move to more of the kind of circular and renewable economies that are based on community principles, community belongings, relationship buildings, and solidarities, mutual support. And there are lots of lessons to be learned out there. So the question is, how do we draw these lessons and work it into our design principles to help us think through open science and openness in its multiple possibilities. And in the end, I'll have some open questions. I don't have answers to them. How could these kind of rethinking help us also redesign self collaborations? And how could we encourage funders and policymakers to, again, think about these notions, community-based, driven research and design? How do we sustain these kind of important endeavor to ensure the kind of diversity of ideas that will help us sustain our life and well-being into the future? So as I suggested, mainstream open science discourses have tend to replicate existing power structures and knowledge asymmetry. And this is the kind of work that we have been trying to document through different research projects. And one of the projects that I was lucky enough to coordinate was this open and collaborative science and development network projects. That finished a few years ago, but we still have lots and lots of lessons that we are drawing from these network and their partners. And this project allows us to work with many, many different research group communities across the global South countries. Many of them are indeed in Latin America, across the Caribbeans and in Colombia, Brazil and Argentina, as well as Mexico. So we had the pleasure and fortune of learning from many of our colleagues from Latin American countries. I would also want to pay tribute to Carolina's father. Actually, in this case, Hector has been a pioneer in looking at traditional knowledge and their integration with scientific practices. Again, these renewable energy sources that farmers have always known about, how to turn a lot of these so-called byproducts of coffee and sugarcane production into usable fertilizer and biofuel that is also much better for the environment and create local independence away from always reliance on import of fuel sources. And so there are lessons that you can learn from many projects, including the one that Hector Botero has been promoting for years, but he reminded us that it is really the traditional knowledge that should define the priorities and conditions under which scientific knowledge is used to advance the project, and not the other way around. That is, we have a tendency to have development funders and to come in and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. These are the kind of water resources we're going to build, and this is kind of power stations that we're going to use, and so forth. There's a lot of imposition from above, policy imposed from above. And the notion of opening science from below is to remind policymakers that there are lots of knowledge that already exists that should be amplified because they serve the community well, much better than those that have been imposed from the outside. And so along this line, we have worked and then worked through the different communities with the different communities to also come up with a set of principles, if you will. These are kind of design principles that we thought we should think about. Again, learning from across the projects, the participants, we collectively came up with this set of open science principles that call for the building of knowledge commons and centering cognitive and epistemic justice, and think about equitable collaborations, and of course, the sustainable development goals through allowing different communities to participate and to amplify their own rights to research and the rights to their knowledge, to their sovereignty, using those knowledge as a means for their own well-being. Again, these principles are by no means final. These are evolving lessons, much like the Panama Declarations that Carolina mentioned earlier. But the point is that these are kind of set of principles and understanding that we collectively came up with based on what our understanding of the time. But as I said, these are things that should be and continue to evolve. And so what we want to encourage is us to collectively think about how to contribute collectively to this framework of pluriversal framework of openness, that think about self-determination. And also want to share with you some of the lessons we've learned from the network. So we put it into a collection, a book that you can download with all the lessons learned from the different partners across the projects. And of course, you can go to the website and read many of the different blog posts and so forth. We also recently, Carolina mentioned the UNESCO Open Science recommendations. I and then several colleagues, Bud Hall, the late Florence Piron, Rajesh Tandon and Lorna Williams, who was a well-known Indigenous advocate of Indigenous knowledge in Canada. We came up with this document that was used towards the recommendations for the UNESCO Open Science principles. And in this document, we argue for of course, the importance of openness to publications and data, but more importantly, we advocate for openness to societal participation, openness to different social forms of knowledge, and also particularly centering historically excluded and marginalized knowledges as a mean to make use of this notion of openness. So openness is not simply about opening a particular type of knowledge, but opening the opportunities to address many past historical injustice as a way to think about open science. And so at the same time, we want to move away from the notion of extractive to the kind of solidarity economies that I mentioned earlier. Now, again, to give you an example of what I mean by extractive economies, if you look at these, again, mainstream science discourse, this one from the European Union, you see the emphasis of these so-called innovation program that had put a lot of emphasis on efficiency and responsiveness, meaning that they can serve industry need really very quickly. And of course, at the same time, they want to encourage researchers to share the data as early as possible because this will have the greatest benefits. Now, these claims, I think, probably, very generic, but again, there's really very little proof to back this up. Now, if you look at a lot of these recent enthusiasm about the COVID research, about how fast researchers are able to share data, better understand how COVID is genetically composed and how they spread, and all that's are true. But in the end, we do have the fact that the COVID vaccines ultimately are owned by 3 different pharmaceutical companies that are the most powerful pharmaceutical companies in the world. So all these benefits of open sharing, open data, and so forth, yes, have a consequence. But the question is whose knowledge is being opened up and who benefits from these kind of knowledge. So open science may be good for some people, but the benefits of openness is not universally shared and enjoyed by all. So this is the kind of question we need to ask ourselves. And in the process, one of our research projects look at really the enclosure of this type of extractionist system of knowledge. Here's a case of Elsevier as a case studies, and Elsevier in the last 10 years have been very aggressively building end-to-end platforms that would take up researchers' data from the start, their submission into a journal, their data citation, their research collaboration, their funding bodies to fund their research. And of course, they then generate this so-called research analytics to sell back to researchers and their institutions and claim that this will help them compete better in the global economy and to better situate themselves in the global university rankings. Right. So many of these narratives, I'm sure, are familiar to those of us in the global north, and they are increasingly common also in the global south and across Latin American countries. Those kind of pressures are coming in. And so, as I said, we need to, think about these mainstream discourse as being beneficial to only some, but not all, and again, think about how a lot of our existing knowledge in the communities. In Latin America, we have long-standing tradition of buen vivir, understanding of collective well-beings, rights of nature, other communal logics, and different narrative about how to transition to a more just and equitable society. And so, again, we don't have to go far. Again, looking at the Zapatista of Chiapas, they have been reminding us for many decades about the importance of autonomy, and that these autonomies are an important design consideration for community well-being itself. So I will finish by, again, making these suggestions. One of the inspiration I draw from is a scholar by the name of Arturo Escobar, a Colombian anthropologist, well known to many people. And in recent years, he has been arguing that we really do think about design as a way of being, because we are controlled often by design. We're structured by design of our, not just the digital design, but all the social design that constrain how we act, how we know, how we interact with each other. But this kind of very homogeneous design, the one world ontology, has really created a very homogeneous world and a rather extractionist world that only benefit a few and create a kind of extreme inequality that we're seeing. And so again, he called for this pluriverse, a way of creating a world where many worlds fit. And I think where we can translate this to scholarly communication and open science is that we have to have a system where many worlds fit. We right now have a system where only one kind of world fits. Impact factors, citation, quantification, and we need different kind of ways to conceive of it. Now, I know
Thank you,
Juan is there, so I will leave it at that particular call, because this is the kind of thinking I've been engaged in, and by no means I understand this fully myself. So it is simply a way of calling out to say, let's work together to think about how to think about inclusive and the kind of design that allow many worlds to coexist. Okay, I'll stop here.
Muchas gracias, Leslie, por esta presentación, también ayudándonos a pensar en el marco alrededor de todos estos temas. Yo creo que las dos presentaciones nos han dado una posibilidad de poder un poco justamente pensar en cómo vamos a interpretar y evaluar y considerar las iniciativas que se van a presentar en lo que sigue de esta serie. He visto que hay muchas preguntas ya en el chat que han entrado. Los invito a hacer más. Voy a invitar a tanto a Leslie como a Carolina también que empiecen a mirar ahí para las que se puedan, porque no vamos a tener tiempo de llegar a todas en lo que ya estamos sobre la hora, pero sí quiero aprovechar para hacer una pregunta por lo menos a cada uno de los panelistas de ahí, de las que están en el chat, y el resto las contestaremos por escrito. Carolina, no sé si puedes también prender tu video también para unirse y pido a los organizadores que nos pongan a los tres en pantalla. Y ¿por qué no empezamos con una pregunta para Carolina? Justamente hay una pregunta de Paula Johanna Rodríguez preguntando justamente a propósito del cambio del gobierno en Colombia y la propuesta de ir más allá de la ciencia abierta tradicionalmente aceptada, si es posible fomentar el desarrollo de este tipo de saberes y a su vez permitirle a las comunidades étnicas del país acceder a lo que se conoce tradicionalmente como ciencia, con el fin de que se conviertan en hacedores de productos científicos sin tener que pertenecer a la élite del país. Creo que la pregunta está enmarcada en el tono del cambio de gobierno de Colombia, pero es una pregunta también creo que se puede generalizar más allá del contexto colombiano, de cómo se podemos pensar en la integración entre los que son considerados los que producen conocimiento científico y los que están produciendo conocimientos que no son valorados por los gobiernos o por el Estado de manera más general.
Casi que la respuesta es la conferencia de Leslie, ¿no? En primer lugar, efectivamente, el cambio de gobierno pues, es muy probable que genere un ambiente diferente para pensar este tipo de aproximaciones, no porque no existan, sino porque, como decía Leslie, hay una narrativa dominante en donde la forma de producir la ciencia tiene unos actores definidos, unos procesos definidos y unos lugares definidos. Pero efectivamente vimos hace unos meses en Colombia una discusión que detonó un documento borrador en donde se hablaba precisamente de saberes tradicionales y de otras formas de ciencia que generó la discusión. Eso produce discusiones y las discusiones pueden generar cambios sociales, pero me parece que la respuesta en términos generales estaba dada por la conferencia de Leslie. Mucha de la ciencia ya se produce en espacios inusuales, por actores inusuales y con, digamos, y nadie por eso está retando el método científico. Por tanto, es un problema de tener una aproximación diferente, mente abierta y generar incluso formas de validación y de evaluación diferentes a las que ya tenemos. Pero no, esa es la conferencia de Leslie. Muchas gracias, Juan.
Gracias, Carolina. Leslie, una pregunta aquí fue hecha al principio de la conferencia, pero creo que puedes hablar de ella, es ¿hasta qué punto o en qué medida la ciencia abierta puede contribuir a intensificar la centralidad que existe en la ciencia de hoy? Let me ask it in English just in case the translation as I read it, but the question I think for you, Leslie, is to what extent is there a risk with open science continuing to amplify the northern centrality of science as there's more focus on that opening of the science from the north? To what extent might that reinforce sort of a colonial science that imposed on the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think the danger is very real. As I said earlier, when we encourage openness of certain things like data and publication, not everybody can take advantage of these data. And very often data are very complicated, and you have to have the infrastructure and the tools to interpret the data and to make sense of the data. So those who have those tools and infrastructure already are more readily be able to benefit from these sort of massive amount of openness, whereas those who don't, who have traditionally been lacking these kind of resources and access, doesn't matter to them. The stuff is out there. They are not able to take advantage of them. But the contrary is true, so that their own knowledge and practices are continually being extracted and they're not being given credit. I think right now the biggest examples, I was looking at an issue on sustainability practices about proposal for different sustainability practices scientists are coming up with. And if you look at a lot of these sustainability practices, 90% of them are traditional practices that are done by peasant community farmers in other parts of the world already. And then a lot of these scientists go and claim that these are new ideas that they are now putting into scientific publication and not giving credits to the communities themselves. Right. And so I think one of the things about open science is we need to be able to say, give credit to all these different communities, allow these communities to record their knowledge and share their knowledge in ways that are beneficial to their own local communities and be given the credit. And of course, then the support by the funding agency and the government to continue their practices so that they are not dependent on these kind of outside imposition.
Gracias, Leslie. Yo creo que estamos ya sobre tiempo. Quedan muchas preguntas todavía por responder. Sí quiero agradecerles. Tenemos más de 50 participantes que se están uniendo y que han tenido paciencia con nosotros después del lento comienzo, pero tampoco quiero abusar de su tiempo más allá de la hora que les habíamos pedido para el evento. Invito a Leslie y a Carolina que revisen las preguntas que están ahí y que tratemos de contestar las que podamos por escrito, pero quiero dar cierre formalmente al evento, a decirles que esto es, como bien dijimos, solamente el comienzo de una serie para poder hablar de estos temas. Ya tenemos agendado el 11 de octubre a esta misma hora a un seminario que va a hablar sobre iniciativas que ayudan al monitoreo del medio ambiente. con Anabela Plos, que va a hablar de la iniciativa de eNaturalist, basado en Argentina, y también a Yanira Cifuentes, que va también a hablar de estrategias para involucrar a la comunidad en hacer el rastreo de aves y la conservación a través de su trabajo con la Asociación Calidris de Colombia. Entonces, nos van a dar 2 primeros ejemplos enfocados con el medio ambiente. Estaremos como anunciando los futuros eventos también que se van a estar haciendo. También cabe mencionar que en Brasil tenemos un panel que está formando parte del evento de Publishing Trends organizado por ABEC, la Asociación Brasilera de Editores Científicos. El panel ese será el 7 de octubre a las 14 horas de Brasil. También mandaremos detalles sobre esta serie a través de el mailing list que tenemos para que se puedan conectar, porque este panel también estará puesto en vivo en la web. Entonces, les quiero agradecer a tanto a Leslie y a Carolina por estar aquí con nosotros, agradecerles a todos ustedes por su paciencia y por estar con nosotros el día de hoy y por acompañarnos en lo que va a ser, yo creo que una serie muy interesante que nos va a permitir justamente ir más allá de lo que, y abrir y ampliar las conversaciones sobre qué quiere decir la ciencia abierta. La página web la pueden encontrar en otracienciaabierta.karisma.org.co y ahí pueden inscribirse a la lista para poder recibir las actualizaciones de los futuros eventos. También pueden seguirnos en redes sociales, en Twitter y Facebook, en una página en @otraciencia. Entonces, con esto les doy muchas gracias, les deseo muy buen día. Y nos vemos el 7 de octubre con el evento de Brasil y el 11 de octubre aquí otra vez con traducción simultánea, esperemos desde el inicio, para nuestro primer panel hablando de iniciativas sobre el medio ambiente. Muchas gracias a todos.